Hey, it's Mel. I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be looking at the true story behind the 1988 classic horror film Child's Play. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with the famous Chucky doll. I've seen all of the Child's Play films. The first one was definitely my favourite. However, I bet you didn't know that the Chucky doll is actually based off a real-life haunted doll. The real-life haunted doll currently resides at the East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. The haunted doll that inspired the film looks nothing like the Chucky doll. Robert the doll is 4 feet tall, the size of a small child, and he is 116 years old, possibly even older. He wears a sailor's hat and a uniform, and he also has a stuffed pet dog. The doll's face is mutilated and his eyes are black. Before the doll was in the Martello Museum, it was owned by a Florida painter named Robert Eugene Otto. To make things less confusing, from now on I'm going to be calling the doll Robert and I'm going to be calling the man Eugene. The doll was given to Eugene when he was 4 years old by a family servant in 1903. This family servant supposedly practiced voodoo and black magic, and she was also mistreated by the Eugene family. The servant was last seen in the back garden conducting some kind of voodoo ritual. The servant was fired on the spot by the mother of the Eugene family. Right before the servant left, she gifted the doll to Eugene. Supposedly, the servant had put a curse on the doll. Eugene loved his doll and called it Robert. Eugene and Robert became best friends and they were inseparable. But soon, strange things would happen around the house. Every time that Eugene would get told off, he would say that, quote, Robert did it. It was always the doll's fault. Eugene had other stuffed toys that were turning up mutilated, and when Eugene was questioned by his mum, like, hey, why are you mutilating your toys? Why are you doing this? Eugene replied, quote, Robert did it, end quote. This was a continuous thing. One time, Eugene's parents entered his room to find Eugene cowering in the corner. He was scared. Robert was found staring at him while sitting on a chair in the center of the room. Other paranormal things were also happening around the house as well. For example, during the night, the family would claim to hear cries coming from Eugene's room. When the parents went into Eugene's room to check on him, they found him asleep and the doll was right by his bed. Neighbors and friends would often visit the Eugene home. During their visit, they would hear Eugene talk to his doll Robert, but then they would hear an unidentified voice reply. Some people just thought that Eugene was making up the voices while he was playing, but the visitors said to the Eugene family that, hey, that's not a voice that your son can make up. The voice was described as being raspy and very deep. Friends of the Eugene family would often stay overnight during their visit, and while they were in their beds trying to sleep, they claimed to hear running around and laughter, but Eugene was asleep at the time this would occur. When the Eugene family would go away on holiday, the neighborhood kids would go on their bikes up and down the street, and sometimes they would look up at the house's windows and claim to see the doll moving around from window to window, and sometimes it would even blink. The great aunt of the Eugene family, who was living in the home at the time, said that it was about time for Eugene to get rid of his doll. However, Eugene didn't like this thought. He wanted to keep his doll as it was his best friend. The aunt suggested locking Robert the doll away in the attic. Oddly enough, the aunt died in her sleep that night due to a stroke, but the Eugene family claim that there was no reasoning for her death as she was in great health. Eugene kept Robert the doll well into his adult years. Eugene inherited his childhood home, which was built in 1890. Eugene went on to marry a woman called Anne. Eugene also continued to carry Robert around with him. Robert even got a seat at the dinner table, which both annoyed and confused Anne. Eugene treated Robert like his own son, even going as far as to build an entire room for him in the attic. Eugene decorated the room and filled it with some of his childhood toys. In 1974, Eugene passed away and Robert remained in the attic. That same year, a woman called Myrtle Reuter bought the house and moved in. Myrtle claimed to hear constant scratching sounds and laughter up in the attic. Myrtle soon found Robert in the attic, and at one point she claimed that it attacked her. Which, I don't know if I buy that, but okay. A reporter named Malcolm came to the house to visit Robert, and he claimed that if you spoke badly of him or Eugene, his facial expressions would change to anger or sadness. Myrtle ended up moving out of the house and she brought Robert with her. Myrtle donated the doll to the Martello Museum and she would die only a few months later. After Myrtle's death, the Eugene house became a tourist attraction known as the Artist House. Eugene gained fame for being both a painter and an author. Once Robert the doll was brought into the Martello Museum, strange things began to happen. People who tried to take photos of Robert and his exhibit were unable to do so as their cameras would malfunction. However, as soon as they would leave Robert's exhibit and go somewhere else, their cameras and phones would be working fine. To this day, the museum receives letters from people asking the doll for forgiveness because they've either mocked it or taunted it. Robert's exhibit is covered in these letters. People who came to the museum to visit Robert and either mocked it or taunted it would then leave the museum and they would either 1. End up in a car crash, or 2. A loved one would die, or 3. They would have a series of bad luck. Staff of the museum claim to see Robert moving around at night and their security cameras will malfunction. Certain staff members have said that they have found Robert in different positions within his glass case. Footsteps have also been heard at night. In 2015, the film Robert was released and it told the true story of Robert the doll. I'd like to point out here also that the sailor hat and uniform that you see Robert the doll wearing, well, that actually belonged to Eugene. So that's the story of Robert the doll that inspired the Child's Play film. Me personally, I don't buy this story, it just seems a bit too much. I'm sad to say that this is the last video of Creep Week. I have had so much fun filming this series for you guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. Happy Halloween, be safe out there. As always, thanks for watching, take care, bye.